Could Scott Peterson ever walk free? Could he get a new trial? Do you believe that he's actually innocent, factually innocent, or didn't receive a fair trial, or a combination?
All three. All three.
Defense Attorney Mark Geragos opening up about case evidence, the new documentary, and what we didn't know about the now infamous convicted killer, Scott Peterson.
The Los Angeles Innocence Project is putting forward new scientific evidence that suggests that Scott Peterson is absolutely innocent.
If you believe you've got the right guy, why wouldn't you test the evidence?
There's so many witnesses who claim to have seen Laci when she was supposed to have already been murdered.
I knew that's the same woman that I see walking a dog.
But first, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and hype the episode. I'm Matt Johnson, and this is Justice. Here to help talk about the case and break it all down is Mark Geragos, criminal defense attorney, podcast host, and represented Scott Peterson. First off, nice to see you, my friend. What sticks out to you about this case, and why do you think it makes headlines year after year?
One of the interesting things about this case is that no matter when I tried the case 20 some odd years after trying the case, there is a phenomena connected with this case. And there's Pat Harris, my co-counsel on the right, used to be my partner, Scott in the middle, and me looking unaffected there. And I'll also talk about that in a second. But one of the things that I found when I would be at the gym in the mornings before trial, and I would inevitably have women who would come up to me and they would say, how can you represent this guy? And I'd say, hold on, what's the issue? And they would say one thing and I would say, well, that actually didn't happen. And then they'd say a second thing and I'd say, well, that never happened. And then a third, whatever the urban legends were. And you would knock them all down and I would explain to them. And I have a lot of patience when it comes to this case. I can talk about it endlessly. And inevitably, the default was, well, I don't care about the evidence. I had an ex once and I can see him doing this. And that's very hard to argue against. And the target demographic, as I've told many of the podcast people that I've interviewed, are white professional women. They can't get past this guy. And one of the reasons I think, and I think there is this image with anybody who followed the case of Laci pregnant, very pregnant, sitting at a Christmas party alone in a chair looking beautiful. And then an image that was famously published side by side, and she's a gorgeous young lady, and pregnancy is always enhances that. But then there was a picture of Scott with his arm around Amber Fry, the blonde. There you go. And when you juxtapose those, it's hard for some people to get past that. They don't care. It's, the adultery for them is not a bridge too far to turn a guy who has not a single solitary violent act in his past into a mass murderer.
Well, we'll talk about the evidence in the case in just a minute. And this new documentary that you're interviewed for, A&E Scott Peterson, The New Evidence, it's a fantastic doc. I encourage everyone to check it out. But on a scale of 1 to 10, do you think that this guy is ever going to get a new trial? Is he ever going to be set free, do you think?
It would be very hard for me, and this is talking about me, to get up every morning and do what I do and do it without believing that he will and being positive about it. I will tell you that the CNN did a poll. In fact, it's sitting up in my office, up on the wall there, in a snow globe right after we lost that case. Does Mark Geragos have a career? And 2/3 of the people voted online that I did have a career. So I'm hopeful that not only I've had a career, but that he will be free.
And what sticks out to you for evidence in this case? So in the new doc, they really dive into a few things that stuck out to me. But I guess the highlights are the burglars, which we'll talk about, people that saw Laci alive with the dog, the San Francisco Bay and the tides and all of the movement, and also Connor and whether or not, the time of death of him, the unborn child, and who wrote the note. So let's begin with the burglars. You don't feel and correct me if I'm wrong, you don't feel that was ever really examined properly, correct?
Well, this is what happened. You showed that earlier picture that had Pat Harris. Pat was fixated, right there on the right. Pat was fixated on the burglary across the street. And when I say fixated, it was the point where sometimes I seriously wanted to have an intervention. And he would, in discovery requests, he would pour through the discovery. Everything was van related because his working theory was, how in the world could Laci Peterson on that street, which was 30 feet wide, clearly we knew, contrary to what the prosecution opening statement was, the prosecution proceeded on this case that she was killed on the 23rd. They pinned her death on the 23rd because they claimed the last known sighting or proof of life is when she called her mom on the day before Christmas Eve. The problem was that all of their theories, and I won't bug you with them, but they conceded by the time we got to closing that clearly she was alive on the 24th, the morning of the 24th. So, and I knew that, I knew that going in, whether it was their own forensic computer analyst who admitted that somebody logged in and looked at items that were consistent with hers on that morning, whether it was the kind of apocryphal story of Martha Stewart being on the Today Show, where they had invested everything and told every judge on a search warrant that that was the 23rd, not the 24th. They were wrong. And the clothing that was in the hamper, we also showed that it was the tan pants that they had linked to the 23rd was already in the hamper, and they didn't even look. So in that lengthy explanation I just gave, covers both the people who saw her on the morning of the 24th and this idea that she was out walking the dog. So if you assume that she was alive on the 24th, the burglary makes sense because this street is only about 30 feet wide. I mean, literally, it's enough for two cars to pass each other. But the Modesto PD took the position the burglary didn't happen on the 24th. It happened on the 26th. Now, this was ludicrous. Ted Rowlands, who was then a local reporter, and you know Ted, as you can see from the smile, Ted used to say, I was there. It was a media scrum. There was a shrine to Laci by 2 days after she was missing. They would have Modesto police would have you believe the burglars were doing a burglary at probably ground zero of the international media, 30 feet away from them, with most of them doing shots that faced the house. So it made no sense that it was on the 26th. The day Scott was convicted, they handed me a report from a guy named Aponte, who was a lieutenant at the Chino prison. He had overheard a call between one of the guys that you just put up on the screen, who was an inmate, and a relative. And they talked about Laci Peterson, realized they were on confronting Laci, realized they were on a recorded call, and quickly shut it down. Mysteriously, not so mysterious if you saw everything I saw, but that tape recorded call disappeared. I never got that document showing that a sworn law enforcement lieutenant had heard this, which also focused on it. And then the biggest piece of evidence that ties all of this together is they knew we were looking for a van. Pat was mocked for looking for a van. This van was discovered 2 days after, burned out, lit on fire with a mattress in the back in the seedy airport district of Modesto. They never turned that over, any of the stuff that they had. They had DNA. They had other stuff that they tested. The only reason we found out about it is the previous OSC issued by the court triggered some guilt by a Department of Justice state analyst who said, wait a second here, I was the one who analyzed the stuff that was in that van. How come this was never brought out? How come it was never disclosed? Which is shocking in a death penalty case.
So has everything been tested? I know that you've been pushing for it with the van. No. And have those men been interviewed?
The men have denied it, as you would expect. They served their burglary term. they've denied it. Nobody's that I know of, absent a couple of wingnuts, are going to confess to a death penalty case. That's number one. Number two, the prosecution has fought tooth and nail extensively to not have this stuff tested. Now, if you were to say, oh, they're fighting for the taxpayer, or they're supporting the taxpayer, I say, fine, I'll pay for whatever DNA testing you want. They don't want to know the truth, because if they did, they would say, we'll gladly test it. Why not test it? Shut up, all the Peterson supporters, shut up anybody who's got a problem with this case. We'll test it and we'll debunk all of this and we'll be done with it. If you had any faith in the integrity and sanctity of your conviction, why wouldn't you do it?
That brings us to the testing of the boat and the theories surrounding the boat and whether or not Laci knew about it. And what's in the documentary is the notes, right? And the scribblings. She probably knew, according to that documentary. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll never forget cross-examining a detective named Brocchini, who was one of the co-lead detectives. I noticed I had put up on the screen a report. Now, mind you, going into this trial, at the beginning of this trial, mitochondrial DNA, that is the DNA that tests basically the maternal lineage, it was not admissible in California. We did a extensive hearing, because before you can get DNA admissible, you have to do a hearing if there's no Court of Appeals decision. That's the law. We did a long hearing, flew in federal DOJ personnel, FBI personnel, and did a extensive hearing on it. And the judge ultimately ruled that the mitochondrial DNA could come in. Why do I talk about that? Because there was a hair found in the boat. The mitochondrial DNA testing, I mean, it shows you how long we've come, Matt, that we're talking about mitochondrial DNA. That's something now that's kind of a throwaway. It's just an assumption. But back then, it was not admissible. But that hair was linked to Laci's maternal lineage by the DNA. And they wanted to get that in, that hair evidence that it was Laci's from the boat, because their working theory was she'd never seen the boat. She didn't know about the boat. The only way her hair would get in the boat is that Scott had killed her somewhere. We don't know where, because they never came up with any explanation for that. Trundled her there to the warehouse and put her in the boat. And that's why he went out. Well, cross-examination during the trial, Detective Brocchini, I put up his report. He had whited out an area. We demanded to see the original. Do you know what he had whited out? That he'd interviewed a woman at that place, that what you just saw in that kind of, it was a warehouse area, who had come into the Scott's warehouse and had seen Laci playing in the boat and doing like this right before she disappeared. And this guy, the lead detective in a special circumstance death penalty case, had taken it upon himself to excise that out of the report so we would never see it.
What other evidence would shock people that you can talk about that you couldn't present in court during trial?
Think, speaking of the boat, I had a young man who worked for me back then go out into the bay, and I bought a boat, the identical boat. We got a dummy that weighed the same amount that Laci did at her last OBGYN appointment. I had Rafi get into the boat. We filmed it as a demonstration, and we put him in the bay at the same time that the prosecution theory was. And I said to him while filming it, just try to dump this dummy into without capsizing.
Release your weight.
He tried it, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. He almost drowned. I mean, he couldn't swim. Of course, I picked the one guy in my office who couldn't swim. But, and I filmed all of that. And I wanted to introduce it. And I thought it was a no-brainer. In fact, the prosecution had done the exact same thing, unbeknownst to me. While I was doing it, they were doing it. The judge allowed in their demonstration, which didn't support their theory, but kind of talked about buoyancy, and excluded our demonstration. Why did that become nettlesome? During the jury deliberations, and mind you, for everybody who says, well, the jury heard everything, the jury foreperson, who was both a doctor and a lawyer, on day 7 of deliberations, when the jury was hung and we were in chambers, said to the judge, Judge DeLucchi, I don't think I can deliver the verdict that would be what the community wants or what the community expects, and I feel threatened by the other jurors. The solution by Judge DeLucchi, and by the way, he's passed away, and I have often said I had the greatest respect for him, and we had an avuncular relationship, but I did curse him out because instead of finding and excluding or removing the jurors who were threatening the foreperson of the jury, who didn't feel safe, he removed the foreperson. And sure enough, the jury immediately came back with the verdict once the foreperson was removed. During deliberations, the jurors wanted to see the boat. You know what they did when they saw the boat? It was in the parking lot of the courthouse. They started to get in to test the buoyancy because they too understood you couldn't do this, that the whole theory made no sense. And I turned to the judge and I said, do you regret excluding my evidence now when the jury's doing this? And he ordered them out of the boat. They couldn't, gave them instruction. That was yet just another. I go on. You don't have enough time for me to go on all of the shenanigans that were pulled in this case.
That is fascinating about the jury view being done on courthouse property and then it being shut down. And then, basically the jury is admonished. And then the fact that you can't bring in your own demonstration when prosecutors can. It's supposed to be a fair system, no matter what you believe about this case. Like what we would see with the Karen Reed trials that I covered, 1 and 2, each parties were allowed to do their own testing. You just kind of have to be able to keep an open mind before you go into that deliberating room. Fascinating, my friend. That's fascinating. Have you talked to Scott? Does he know about the documentary?
I have not talked to him. I would imagine that he does. He writes me occasionally. I purposely stepped away after the conviction for a variety of reasons, not the least of which because it was then a death sentence, and I wanted them to be able to use ineffective assistance of counsel if it was necessary. So I didn't want to be in the mix of that. I will cooperate whenever asked. As you said, I will, as I said to you, I'll pay for DNA testing because I've lost enough sleep over this case and my belief that he did not do this, that I want him vindicated and I want him out of custody.
A big part of that, if this ever goes to trial again, is Amber Frey, who you mentioned.
Okay, first of all, I met Scott Peterson November 20th, 2002. Scott told me he was not married. We did have a romantic relationship.
She has gone on interviews to say that she, or at least Gloria Allred, who represented her, has gone on to say that she's ready to testify again if it ever gets to that point.
She has indicated that if it were necessary, she would do it again if there was another trial, because she has said the truth is the truth and it doesn't change with the passage of time.
What do you make of the affair factor in this trial? Do you think that that was some of the strongest evidence for prosecutors in the case?
I think there were two things. I think where the bodies washed up was where he said he was. Mind you, you have to, that has to be explained in terms of the 4 months that elapsed between her disappearance and everybody in the world who was following the case knew what his so-called alibi was. I think that was compelling. And the tapes were, speaking of Pat Harris, Pat always said the tapes were bad.
Amber. Hey. Hey there. I got tired
But I had a different perspective on the tapes. I was just coming off having represented at the time Gary Condit in Modesto. Gary was a congressman who covered that area in Modesto. Gary was caught up right before 9/11 with the disappearance of Chandra Levy, who was a intern in Washington, D.C. from Modesto. That case took a turn immediately when there was the allegation that Gary was having an affair or sex with Chandra Levy, that all bets were off. To the point where when I was representing Gary, I used to say, what are you doing? You've got a guy in custody in Washington, D.C., who you've already convicted and believe is good for mugging women who are jogging in the park that Chandra used to jog in the morning. So the most obvious explanation to me, and I used to say this to the U.S. attorneys who were acting as the prosecutors, I said, what are you doing? I said, obviously it's wintertime. When the ice melts, unfortunately, that's when you're going to find Chandra. And sure enough, that's what happened. And so anybody who was a sentient being with neurons fired and who was living in Modesto would have known, including Scott Peterson, that the minute Amber Fry showed up, all bets were off. They were not going to look for Laci anymore, and all the suspicion was going to focus like a laser on him.
We've kind of talked about Scott Peterson and how a lot of the general public perceives him. Let's be frank. A lot of people just don't like the guy. Did you see the same person when you were working with him behind the scenes? Were you also his counsel when he did those interviews with like Diane Sawyer and other outlets?
Violence towards women is unapproachable. It is the most disgusting act to me. And I know that suspicion has turned to me.
What kind of marriage was it?
God, I mean, the first word that comes to mind is, glorious. I mean, we took care of each other very well. She was amazing. She is amazing.
Another story that is out there is that the kitchen was spotless.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there was still a wet mop around, which indicated somebody had cleaned something very recently.
Laci was mopping the floors when I left that morning. Yes, the house was spotless. She had a cleaning lady on Monday, the 23rd.
So if the cleaning lady had been there, why have to clean again?
Dog, 2 cats, muddy backyard.
You haven't mentioned your son.
I had breakfast.
Why would he go on camera and say stuff like that?
I had breakfast with Diane Sawyer maybe 3 months ago, completely unrelated to this, in New York. And the first thing I told her is, I said, I've had 3 trials, Scott being one of them, Susan McDougal being another, and a third I won't mention, but
Michael Jackson?
3 trials. And in those 3 trials, I've had to deal with a Diane Sawyer interview of my client that I've inherited. And I said, Diane, I love you, but there is no way, because we were talking about it. I said, there's no way prior to a trial that I'm ever going to let you interview any client of mine, because I've got exhibit A, B, and C. For those out there looking for a practice tip, and Diane will probably never pay for breakfast again, but I highly advise never having Diane Sawyer interview your client before you go to trial.
Well, she's fantastic. I hope to meet her one day. I'm a big fan of her. And, it was a fascinating interview. It was a fascinating interview.
She's an iconic figure in a lot of ways. I mean, she really is the larger than life iconic legend. So
yeah, and a trailblazer. She did the evening news and she did morning television, all that. We talked about searching for justice, and that's everyone is deserved a defense. A lot of people give defense attorneys bad raps, but everyone has deserved a defense, and you're among the best. We know that. But I know that Laci's family is also searching for justice. They've been critical over this constantly being in the news and of, his right to file appeals.
It has definitely been a roller coaster since December 24th, 2002. There's many times that I get up in the morning and I just go back to bed. I'm never going to get over this. I don't say how any parent will ever get over it. You just have to get through it.
What is your message for them, or do you have anything to say?
I've often said, and I don't know Sharon well, and although we were in the same courtroom every day for what seemed like eons, I've often said the toughest cases I handle are actually the ones where I'm representing somebody who's lost a child in a wrongful death civil case or something like that. In fact, I did one earlier this year, and I almost always swear I'll never do that again, because it tears your soul out. I mean, it really does. It eats away at you. So the idea of losing a child before you is just unthinkable. And so, I can't go there in terms of the grief. What I can do, however, is just remind everybody that until Amber Frey, everybody was uniformly in Scott's corner. Until Amber Frey, that is what turned things. And I get that, I understand, but as I said, you can be a cad, but that doesn't make you a murderer. And far be it for anybody else to get into what the state of their marriage was. That's between the husband and the wife and the two partners. So I don't know what they were doing. I don't know what Laci knows or did know at the time, and that's just above my pay grade. What I will tell you is it still remains the only case where somebody was, I can't think of any other case where, that I've handled or anybody else, where there was not one violent prior incident where somebody lived and walked on this earth for decades and never had anybody accuse him of a violent incident, and on top of it had a nun testify who knew him as well. So I don't know. I mean, you could send a central casting for that. You couldn't script that because nobody would believe it.
Final question. Do you believe that he's actually innocent, factually innocent, or didn't receive a fair trial, or a combination?
All three. Nobody knew the evidence in real time. I certainly don't now. It's been 25 years and probably 10,000 cases since then. But in real time, I knew the evidence inside out, and I had to, because there's over 100 witnesses, and I cross-examined 70% of them. And then I basically lived with him, meaning I spent all day, every day, either in the courtroom or in lockup with him. And I have said this to friends of mine, at a certain point, kind of the Malcolm Gladwell theory, you do 10,000 reps or 10,000 hours, you start to learn your trade. Well, one of the things that I think I have learned is when somebody's good for something, meaning they did it. I never have seen anything before, during, or after that leads me to believe he did it. And biggest mistake I made in this case was agreeing with the prosecution to not have cameras in the courtroom, because I thought it would damp down the kind of crazy interest in it. Remember, I was representing Michael and Scott at the same time. And you could not have found two more polar opposites in terms of the public reaction. I mean, I tell this story and it's true. My website crashed when it was announced I was representing Scott. Almost 500,000 people kind of blew it up, most praying that I would have cancer. And the same thing when Michael Jackson, but most saying prayers, I hope you live a long life. So the public animosity towards Scott was one of the reasons that ultimately my father said, look, if you're afraid of your reputation, you're in the wrong business.
Mark Geragos, criminal defense attorney and podcast host of In the Well with Matt Murphy. And also you work with Harvey Levin on Two Angry Men. How else can we get a hold of you?
Well, in my OG podcast, which was originally with Adam Carolla, called Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. And, I'm pretty easy to find, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Matt. It's always good to talk to you.
The DA's office releasing this statement in light of the documentary. In part, it reads this: a documentary can be edited, produced, and marketed to tell whatever story draws the most viewers. It cannot change what the evidence actually shows, and it cannot undo what a jury concluded or a judge who read every page of the record has already decided. Our thoughts are with Laci's family and friends that have to relive this every time it's back in the headlines. I'll keep you updated on this case and others, so please check out the video section of this YouTube channel. Also, while you're there, please hit the like and subscribe, and I'll keep you updated. But in the meantime, take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.